You can probably hear the refrigerator humming behind me. There's rain on the roof, too. I'm 72 now, and my hands shake, so if the tape hisses, that's just age, not nerves. My name's Daniel Hargrove. I used to be a geneticist. I retired in September 2007, moved out near the Cascades in Washington, figured I'd spend my winters reading by the stove and listening to the wind in the firs. That's all I wanted. Ordinary silence. Instead, I spent 7 years studying Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. I hate even using the word Bigfoot, but there isn't another name for what crossed my path, or what ended up in my basement. I shouldn't be telling this, but it's been years. The rain's coming harder now. The first time I heard the 3 knocks, I told myself it was just the house settling. The wipers were thudding slow across the windshield, and the old truck heater made this low, tired whine. I had the local AM station on, more static than music, just something to fill the drive. You can probably hear that same static on this old tape like it never left. Late September in the Cascades has a particular quality. The light comes in low and gold through the evergreens, and the air smells like wet bark and cold stone. The highway curved through dense stands of Douglas fir, the kind of forest that swallows sound and makes you feel like the last person on Earth. That's when I first heard the word Bigfoot up here. Some call-in show, guy talking about seeing one cross Highway 2 in the fog. The host laughed, dismissive and sharp. I did too. I was a retired scientist, fresh out of the university. Boxes of textbooks rattling in the back. 40 years of peer review had trained me to dismiss folklore like that. I told myself all that Bigfoot talk was just local color, something for tourists. When I pulled up to the cabin, the porch light threw this weak amber circle onto the wet gravel. Rain had been falling all afternoon, turning the dirt road into a ribbon of mud. A single black feather was stuck between the railing boards, slick with rain, trembling slightly in the breeze. Inside, the boards creaked under my boots. Wind pressed against the walls like a slow exhale. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust and the faint mildew of a place that had sat empty too long. I unpacked in silence, setting my books on shelves, my coffee maker on the counter, trying to make the space feel like mine. It was quiet until right before I went to bed. 3 slow knocks came from the back of the house, spaced out, hollow like someone tapping on the siding with a knuckle. Deliberate, patient. I checked the door, told myself again Bigfoot was just radio nonsense, and wrote it off as the wind catching a loose shutter or a branch. But I still heard those 3 knocks in my head when I lay down, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. You can hear the clink of the spoon here in the recording. That's how often I've listened to this memory. I remember the sound of my own coffee stirring, the scrape of ceramic against porcelain. The diner smelled like burnt toast, cheap bacon, and wet wool from jackets hung by the door. October rain streaked the windows, blurring the parking lot into watercolor grays and greens. I was sitting with a farmer named Ray and a woman who ran the feed store. I never caught her first name, just knew her as Marla from the feed store. They talked about winter coming in early this year, about elk moving down from the high country, about a bear that got into someone's chickens and tore through a reinforced coop like it was cardboard. The coffee was weak, the kind that tastes more like hot water with a memory of beans. But it was warm, and the company was easy. Then Ray leaned back in the booth and grinned at me, his weathered face creasing into deep lines. "You hear any of that Bigfoot talk up by your place yet?" he asked. I chuckled, pushing my glasses up the bridge of my nose. "I'm a scientist," I said. "I don't really do the Bigfoot stuff." They laughed, but Marla leaned forward, her expression more serious. "My cousin swears something big walks the ridgeline behind her property. She's seen tracks, wide as dinner plates, smells like a wet dog rolled in pennies, knocks on the house when her husband's on night shift. That smell stuck with me more than the punchline, wet dog and metal. Such a specific detail. Ray added, her husband thought she was making it up until he heard it himself. 3 knocks, always 3, like someone asking permission. I stirred my coffee again, the spoon clinking rhythmically. Probably just bears, I said, trying to sound casual. They can be curious. When I drove back that afternoon, clouds sat low over the firs, gray pressing into green like wet felt. The road was empty. No other cars, no hikers, just me and the sound of tires on wet asphalt. On my porch, someone had set a little wicker basket, old, handmade, the weaving tight and even, with 3 small river stones stacked inside. No note, no card, just that basket, already damp from the mist, sitting precisely in the center of the top step. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. The stones were smooth, river-worn, deliberately chosen, not random, not accidental. I told myself it was a neighbor's kid, some folksy welcome. Mountain people did things like that, right? Not Bigfoot, never Bigfoot. That night, as the refrigerator hummed and the clock ticked in the kitchen, I heard 3 knocks again, this time from the front wall. Same spacing, same hollow sound, like knuckles on wood. I walked the house twice, lights on, checking windows and doors. Nothing. No one. But the basket stayed on the railing, and I couldn't shake the word Bigfoot from my head, couldn't stop thinking about wet dog and pennies and 3 deliberate knocks. You know that sound sleet makes on a metal roof? Like fingers drumming too fast, urgent and chaotic. That's what it sounded like, behind the feed store, the night I met the hunters. December had come in hard and cold. Breath steamed in the air, and the smell of gasoline, manure, and cold wet earth mixed into something sharp that caught in the back of your throat. Ray introduced me to them in a low voice, like we were in church or at a funeral. "These boys got something weird in the truck," he said, his eyes darting between me and them. "Figure a science man like you might have an opinion, Dr. Hargrove, about this Bigfoot nonsense." The truck sat under a flickering security light, its yellow glow pulsing with the rhythm of failing electricity. In the back, under a green tarp, something long and heavy was strapped down with rope and bungee cords. The whole truck had that same smell the woman described weeks ago. Wet fur and old pennies with a rotten, sweet undertone that made the back of my throat tighten and my stomach turn. One of the hunters was young, maybe 30, with a red beard and nervous hands. The other was older, quiet, watching me with pale eyes that gave nothing away. The younger one lifted a corner of the tarp. I saw maybe a foot of dark, matted hair and a shape beneath. Something massive, something wrong. I didn't let them pull it higher. I didn't want a clear image burned into my memory. Just weight, just implication, just enough to know. "Shot it up in the foothills," the older one said, his voice flat. "Bigger than any bear we've ever seen. Walked upright. Folks say Bigfoot, you know?" My mouth went dry. "I don't work with animals," I lied. "Not anymore. I'm retired." But my mind was already ticking through possibilities. 7 years of pension sitting in the bank, a basement that could be converted, a brain still wired for sequences and codes and patterns, equipment I could still access through old colleagues. The sleet hit the tarp in a steady hiss. Somewhere down the alley, a dog barked twice, then went quiet, like someone had shushed it. "We could sell it north," the young one said. "Taxidermist up in British Columbia, he'd pay good money. Or we could just bury it, forget we ever saw it." The older hunter looked at me. "Or we could sell it to someone who might actually care about what it is." I walked away that night pretending I didn't care about Bigfoot at all, pretending my hands weren't shaking, pretending I hadn't already started planning. But I kept smelling wet fur and metal all the way home, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might be under that tarp when I lay in bed listening for 3 knocks that came again, right on schedule, patient and persistent. You can hear the crunch of gravel under my tires on the old recording when I talk about this. That morning, late January, fog sat knee-high over the ruts, and the barn was just a darker shape against a gray sky. My breath smoked in the cab of my truck. I kept telling myself I wasn't really doing this, wasn't really about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. The hunters waited inside, lantern hissing on a hook, the air full of diesel fumes and hay dust and cold. The body was on a low table, still under that green tarp, bound tight with rope. Someone had reinforced the table with cinder blocks. "Last chance, Doc," the older one said. "You wanted your Bigfoot. Here it is. Hunters up north are already asking. We can't hold it much longer." "I don't believe in Bigfoot," I said, and it was almost true. "I believe in DNA. I believe in data." We didn't discuss where exactly they found it. We didn't discuss permits or legality or what would happen if anyone found out. A metal cash box sat on a crate. My savings went into their pockets in a few counted bundles. $7,000. Most of my retirement cushion. Gone. That box, that tarp, those ropes, simple artifacts keeping a line between my old life and whatever I was starting. When they left, the silence in the barn felt enormous. Only the soft drip of melting frost from the rafters, the occasional creak of old wood settling. The lantern hissed and flickered, throwing shadows that moved like living things. I didn't lift the tarp all the way, just enough to see hair, coarse, dark, matted with dried blood and dirt, a suggestion of limb, massive and wrong, enough to know it wasn't elk, wasn't bear, wasn't any animal I'd studied in 4 decades of work. Then I covered it again quickly. I didn't want the full shape in my head. Not yet. Only the samples. Only the science. Back at the cabin, the basement smelled instantly of wet fur and iron and something else, something primal that made my hindbrain scream warnings. I dragged the tarp-wrapped weight down the steps alone, each thud echoing up into the quiet kitchen. It was heavier than I expected. Denser. That night, as the refrigerator hummed and the wind slid along the eaves, the 3 knocks came again. This time, they were on the basement door. Sharp, deliberate, spaced like punctuation, like someone knew exactly what I'd brought home. I stood there in the kitchen, hand on the knob, telling myself no Bigfoot could knock. Bigfoot was myth. This was just tissue, just data. But I didn't open it. I waited until the knocking stopped, then went to bed with every light in the house burning. You can almost hear the old freezer in this part of the tape, a constant low growl beneath my voice, like distant thunder. I turned my basement into a makeshift lab, nothing extraordinary, nothing that would draw attention. Just what a retired scientist could afford. A second-hand microscope I bought online, a small DNA sequencer I borrowed from a former student who didn't ask questions, notebooks stacked on a folding table, an old woven basket on the shelf where I kept glass vials cushioned in rags. For 7 winters, snow piled up outside while I stayed below ground with whatever was under that tarp. I never unwrapped it fully, never looked at the whole thing at once. I couldn't. I took tissue samples, hair follicles, bone splinters, working, like a dentist operating blind, and then wrapped everything tighter again. The smell never left. Wet fur, copper, damp earth, decay. I washed my hands until they cracked and bled, but the smell clung to me, worked into my skin. I ran every test I could without crossing lines I couldn't uncross, without involving other people, without leaving a trail. I told myself over and over like a mantra. There is no Bigfoot, Daniel. This is a misidentified bear, a malformed something, an elaborate hoax. But the numbers fought me. The sequences slid into patterns that were wrong in a very specific way. Not alien, not monstrous. Close, uncomfortably close. Like a melody played on the same scale as human, just shifted a half step here and there. Minor instead of major. Familiar, but foreign. I checked the locks twice every night before going down to work. I checked the results 3 times every morning before allowing myself coffee. Each time I reran the data, calibrated the equipment, verified the controls, the answer came back nudging toward the same impossible conclusion. Whatever I had in my freezer was more human-like than any bear or ape or known primate had the right to be. The chromosomal count was wrong. The protein markers were wrong. Everything was wrong in ways that suggested something that shouldn't exist. On certain nights, when the furnace cycled off and the basement went very quiet, I heard sounds from beyond the small basement window, snow dripping from the eaves, branches shifting in wind. And sometimes, very softly, a low, almost conversational knock on the foundation wall. 3 taps, always 3. Every time I told myself wind, roots, expanding ice, imagination, anything but the truth. I refused to say Bigfoot out loud, even to my own notes. I coded it as Subject X, or Unknown Specimen, or just Sample. But in my head, late at night, I knew. I'd always known. By the 5th year, the routine had worn grooves into my life deep enough to get lost in. Wake up, coffee, check the notebooks, check the backup drives twice. Go outside just long enough to remember the world had colors other than freezer white and basement gray and the sickly yellow of fluorescent lights. There's a narrow break in the trees behind the cabin where the forest starts in earnest, where the managed land gives way to true wilderness. I began dumping non-critical waste there, soil from sample holes, used rags sealed in plastic bags, sawdust from the work table. It was laziness at first, not wanting to drive to the county dump. Then it became something like a ritual, a strange offering I didn't fully understand. I remember that day in spring 2012 because of the color of the moss. Electric green after the rain, shining under a sky the exact shade of wet slate. The whole forest seemed to glow. I could hear water running somewhere down the slope, the first frogs of the season starting up their chorus, a woodpecker hammering somewhere distant and hollow. When I came back the next morning with another bag, something had changed. In the spot where I'd left the sealed bags and gloves, there was a small arrangement of sticks and stones. Not random scatter, not wind-blown debris. Deliberate, intentional. 3 flat stones stacked in a cairn, 3 thin branches leaned carefully into a tiny tripod, and on top of it all, a clump of hair that looked too familiar, dark and matted, the same coarse texture I'd been handling for years. Beside the arrangement sat an old apple, bruised and bitten once, as if tasted and offered back. The smell in that clearing hit me immediately. Wet fur, rich soil, something musky and heavy that didn't belong to deer or bear or any animal I knew. I stood there a long time, listening. Rain ticking on leaves, a distant woodpecker, my own breath coming quick and shallow. Then, from deeper in the trees, maybe 100 yards in, 3 hollow knocks. Wood on wood, far but clear, unmistakable. I don't believe in Bigfoot, I whispered to myself, voice shaking. I do not believe in Bigfoot, but someone or something had rearranged my trash into a message. And the message knew exactly what I'd been cutting up in my basement. The hair matched. The placement was too deliberate. They were telling me they knew. That night, the 3 knocks came again, once on the wall, once on the basement window, once on the porch railing. A circuit around the house, a perimeter check. I pretended I didn't understand, but I did. You can hear the wind rising on this part of the tape. It sounds like distant traffic, but it's just the storm building. The power flickered twice that evening while I was in the basement, comparing sequences on my laptop screen. Autumn storms in the Cascades are like that, sudden, impatient, almost angry. They sweep down from the mountains with barely any warning. The freezer hummed along steadily, the single bare bulb buzzing over my head. On the table, my notebook lay open next to an old smartphone I'd started using as a camera, its cracked screen reflecting the bare light. I'd been documenting everything, taking photos of results, recording voice notes I thought I might use for a paper someday. I wrote a line I'd been avoiding for 7 years, my hand shaking slightly as I formed the words, "Subject may represent a lineage closer to Homo than any known non-human primate. If this is Bigfoot, then Bigfoot is not a monster. Bigfoot is kin." As I finished the sentence, the power went out. The basement dropped into absolute black. The silence was total for a heartbeat, so deep I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears, hear the blood rushing through my veins. Then the storm noise rushed in, rain on the roof like gravel being poured, branches scraping the siding, the faint rattle of the basement window in its frame. I sat there in complete darkness, letting my eyes adjust to the thin gray leaking in from that window. The air felt thicker somehow, like the room was suddenly crowded, like I wasn't alone. Then came the 3 knocks on the basement door. Not tentative, not shy, not questioning. Deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. The sound went through the wood and right into my chest, vibrating in my sternum. I could hear something else too, just barely. A slow, heavy breathing on the other side. Not animal panting, not the quick breath of fear. Measured, controlled. Almost human. Every rational part of me said, "Call it a bear, Daniel. Call it wind. Call it anything but Bigfoot." I reached for the flashlight I always kept on the table, switched it on with trembling fingers, and pointed it at the door. The beam shook in my hand, dust drifting through it like snow, dancing in the cone of light. I didn't open the door, but for the first time in 7 years, I whispered, "If you're a Bigfoot, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to desecrate your family." The breathing paused, stopped completely. Then the knock stopped, and only the storm answered, wind howling around the eaves. I came up the basement stairs slow, one hand on the railing, flashlight beam jumping with each careful step. The house felt wrong, like someone had taken a layer of air away, leaving everything compressed and heavy. No hum from the fridge, no tick from the wall clock. Just the wind pushing against the siding and the occasional distant crack of a branch giving up under ice and wind. In the kitchen, the amber porch light still burned outside, the only light still working, powered by a different circuit or maybe a backup battery I didn't know about. It threw a soft cone of warm color across the wet boards of the porch, illuminating the falling rain in vertical streaks. The smell of damp wood and old coffee lingered in the kitchen. Everything was familiar but felt foreign in the darkness and silence. That's when I saw the shadow in the window. I wasn't looking directly at it. I caught it in the glass of the cabinet first, a reflected darkness, a darker shape against the night. Tall enough that the top of it was cut off by the window frame, 7 feet at least, maybe more. The porch boards creaked under a weight that wasn't mine. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, waiting. I didn't see a face. Not clearly, not distinctly. Just a suggestion of an outline where the amber light bent around something standing very still, very close to the glass. Then, in the lower part of the window, something caught the light. A glint, round and moist, reflecting the room back at me. An eye. There was a sound, too. A low exhale, rough around the edges, almost like a sigh, like someone trying not to cry in the dark. The smell reached me next. Wet fur, earth, that metallic tang I'd lived with for years, only fresher, warmer, alive. Not dead tissue in a freezer, living breath. My first instinct was terror, yes. Pure animal fear that shot adrenaline through my system, made my legs weak. But it was tangled with something else I didn't expect. Shame. Deep, crushing shame. Like I'd been caught dissecting a relative. Like I'd violated something sacred. "Bigfoot," I said, barely audible, the word catching in my throat. "If you are a Bigfoot, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I just wanted to understand." The porch boards creaked again, a shift of weight from one foot to another. The shadow tilted slightly, just enough that the glint of the eye slid out of the direct light, but I could still feel it watching me. Then, very softly, right against the siding by the window frame, knock, knock, knock. The sound was gentler this time, almost acknowledging, almost forgiving. And then the shadow stepped back slowly, dissolving into the night beyond the porch light's reach, absorbed by darkness and rain. The refrigerator kicked back on suddenly, making me jump hard enough to drop the flashlight. It clattered on the floor, beams spinning wildly. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table, notebooks and the old wicker basket in front of me, listening to wind and rain and wondering if I'd just hallucinated Bigfoot out of guilt and isolation and 7 years of obsession. But I knew I hadn't. I knew it was real. After that night, denial got harder to wear, but I still tried. That's the part people don't understand. You can have something living knock on your house, you can see its eye in your window, and still spend weeks arguing with yourself that it was anything but what it was. I dove back into the work with renewed intensity. The freezer hummed like always, and the basement smelled permanently of bleach over wet fur, chemicals battling biology and losing. I digitized all my old notes, every scribbled observation, every measurement. I copied everything twice onto cheap external drives I kept in a shoebox, then made a third backup that I mailed to a storage unit 2 towns over. Every so often, a floorboard would pop above me, or a tree would scrape the siding, and I'd pause in my work, listening for those 3 knocks. The sequences didn't care about my doubts or my fear. They lined up more cleanly than they had any right to. The more data I accumulated, the worse it got. Whatever I'd been cutting samples from under that tarp had genetic markers that slid closer and closer to human with every test. Not bear, not ape, not any known species. Something that sat too near us on the family tree. A cousin we'd forgotten about, or refused to acknowledge. One night, I set my old smartphone on a stack of notebooks and hit record. You can hear it on the tape. My voice is thin, exhausted, maybe a little broken. If this is Bigfoot, then Bigfoot isn't a wild legend. Bigfoot is a people we've refused to see, maybe on purpose, maybe because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging what we've done. While I spoke, there's a faint sound under my words. I didn't hear it until years later, playing the recording back, turning the volume all the way up. 3 knocks, distant, but there, perfectly timed. Like someone answering a prayer I didn't mean to say out loud. I wrote a draft paper I knew I could never submit. Anonymized, stripped of all location data, just the raw genetic sequences and comparative analysis graphs. Just the science. It still felt like betrayal, like exposing someone who'd asked for privacy. The old woven basket sat by my feet, now holding labeled vials instead of river stones. Every time the freezer cycled on or off, the light flickered, and for a second, the reflection in the metal surface made it look like someone was standing behind me, watching over my shoulder. I slept less, checked the porch more, started leaving small offerings at the tree line, apples, nuts, jerky. They were always gone by morning, replaced with arrangements of stones or feathers, or once, inexplicably, a perfectly intact bird's nest. Every time I hovered over send on an email I'd never finish, I heard phantom knocks in my head and thought of that eye in the window, that moment of connection. I couldn't do it, couldn't expose them to what would come next. Hunters, researchers, cameras, chaos. You can probably hear my boots in the snow when I talk about this. That crunch has lived in my memory. Replays every time I close my eyes. February 2015. The sky was a flat, pale gray, the kind that erases time of day, makes morning and afternoon indistinguishable. I'd wrapped what remained under the tarp, diminished now after 7 years of samples, in an old wool blanket, then laid it carefully into the same wicker basket that once held stones and gifts. It took both hands to carry, my shoulders burning with the weight, my breath puffing white in the frozen air. I followed the same narrow break in the trees where I'd dumped waste years before, where the gifting had started. The air grew colder, quieter, until even the distant highway noise disappeared completely. All that was left was the squeak of my boots in snow and the occasional soft crack of an iced branch surrendering to weight. At the small clearing I'd come to think of as the spot, a natural hollow ringed with ferns, buried under snow and old stumps, dark against white. I stopped. Someone had been there before me. 3 stacks of stones stood around the center of the clearing, each carefully balanced despite the snow, each topped with a feather or a bit of bone or a dried flower. A shrine. A memorial. I set the basket down in the middle, my hands shaking from more than cold. For the first time in 7 years, I pulled the blanket back more than a few inches. I still won't describe what I saw in detail. The shape isn't the point. The feeling is. It felt like looking at a distant cousin laid out on a metal table in a morgue, like recognizing family in the curve of bone, the structure of hand, like grief and shame and wonder all tangled together. "I think you were a Bigfoot," I said, my voice shaking, breaking on the words. "And I think Bigfoot deserves. Better than my freezer? Better than being cut up by a stranger? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I covered it again with the blanket, arranged it gently, stepped back, waited. For a long time, nothing happened. Just whined in the high branches and a raven calling somewhere out of sight, its voice harsh and lonely. Then, from the tree line opposite where I'd come in, there was a sound, a low, almost questioning whoop rising at the end, followed by another from a different direction, then a third, deeper, like an answer or an acknowledgement. The smell came next, riding the cold air. Wet fur, earth, something warm and alive and close. I didn't see them clearly. Just hints between trunks, a darker vertical line where no tree should be, a shift of weight, a sense of being watched by multiple pairs of eyes that made every hair on my arms stand up under my coat. Then, as if coordinated, 3 knocks echoed through the clearing from different directions. Not close this time, but all around me, like the forest itself was returning my message, accepting what I'd brought. I bowed my head. It felt absurd, a retired scientist bowing to shadows in the woods, but it also felt right, necessary. "I won't publish," I whispered into the cold air. "Not like this. Not if it puts you, any Bigfoot, in more danger. You have my word." The wind picked up, and snow shook down from the branches, pattering softly on my coat and hood. When I finally looked up, blinking snowflakes from my eyes, the sense of presence had faded, like someone walking backward into fog, dissolving. I left the basket there with its burden and walked home without looking back, my footprints the only mark I left. That night, for the first time in 7 years, there were no knocks on the house. Just silence, just wind, just peace. You can hear kids playing faintly from the road on this part of the tape, my neighbor's grandsons, riding bikes, their voices high and carefree. That was summer 2016. That's when they came, the men who made sure my 7 years stayed a secret. They didn't say who they were exactly. 2 sedans, dark and plain, pulling up my driveway slow and deliberate. 4 men in plain clothes, windbreakers despite the heat, that whole quiet confidence that says, you don't want trouble with us. Federal, maybe, or private contractors working for someone with enough power to care about Bigfoot. The porch boards creaked under their boots, same way they did under that shadow years before. The amber light was off. Broad daylight made everything look harmless, almost normal, just men, just questions. "Dr. Hargrove," the older one said, flashing something too quickly for me to read. A badge, probably. Maybe real, maybe not. "We've heard a rumor you've been working on unusual biological material, something the locals are calling Bigfoot." He said the word like it tasted bad, like something distasteful he had to acknowledge but didn't want to. My heart hammered so loud, I'm surprised. It's not on the recording. Inside the house, the refrigerator hummed its normal hum, the clock ticked its normal tick, and my external drives sat in a shoebox on top of the pantry where they couldn't see them, wouldn't think to look. The basement freezer was empty now, scrubbed with bleach until the plastic was nearly white again. I studied an unknown sample, yes, I said carefully, choosing each word. If it was Bigfoot, it's gone. I returned it to the forest. The data didn't survive. Old man with old equipment. Things corrupt. Hard drives fail. They asked polite questions with sharp edges underneath. Had I shared anything, posted online, published, sent samples to other labs, mailed anything to colleagues? I thought of the unsent drafts on my computer, the deleted email attachments, the one paper I'd printed and burned in the wood stove one sleepless night, watching the pages curl and blacken. Why would you throw away 7 years of work? The younger one asked, actually sounding curious, almost respectful. You're a scientist. This could have been the discovery of the century. I looked past him, toward the tree line. The afternoon light turned the firs almost black against a washed-out sky, made them look like a wall of shadow. Somewhere back there, I imagined, a Bigfoot family remembered the man who'd cut up one of their own, and then, finally, brought them home. Because some doors don't need to be opened, I said slowly. And some families, human or Bigfoot, deserve their graves left alone, deserve their privacy, their dignity. A long silence, just the distant sound of a chainsaw starting up on another property, the mechanical scream cutting through summer air, a jay screeching from the fence line. Ordinary rural sounds. They exchanged glances I couldn't read. In the end, they left with nothing but my word. Maybe they believed me, maybe they didn't, maybe they'd be watching. Maybe I'd get another visit someday. That night, I checked the locks twice again, out of habit, checked the windows, looked out at the tree line in the gathering dark. There were no knocks, just wind in the eaves like a low, steady breath, like something exhaling, like relief. If you listen to this part of the tape, you'll hear a different hum in the background. Not the old freezer, but traffic from a highway a mile away. I moved closer to town after that visit, after the men in windbreakers. Told people the drive from the cabin was getting too hard in winter for a man my age. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Couldn't walk past the basement door without remembering. Couldn't look at the tree line without wondering if they were still watching, still waiting. Couldn't handle the weight of what I knew. In the attic above this little house, there are 3 cardboard boxes with my handwriting on them in thick black marker. One holds notebooks, edges curled from humidity and age, pages full of numbers and sketches of genetic sequences and tree lines. Another has the external drives in that same shoebox, dusty now, outdated technology holding data no one will ever see. The third has the old wicker basket, slightly crushed from being moved, still smelling faintly of damp wood, and something I can't name but recognize immediately every time I open that box. Sometimes, late at night, when the TV downstairs is just a low murmur and the refrigerator cycles off, the silence presses in just like it did up there in the woods. I find myself getting up from my chair, checking the porch light out of habit, listening for 3 knocks I know won't come, can't come, not here. I still hate saying the word, but when I open those boxes on restless nights, I think, I spent 7 years with Bigfoot in my basement. I spent 7 years listening to Bigfoot knock on my walls. Then I correct myself, force myself to consider alternatives. Maybe it was all misinterpretation. Maybe the DNA was contaminated from the start. Maybe the sounds were just branches and wind and an old house settling. Maybe the smells were my imagination, my mind filling in details to match expectations. I list the rational possibilities like a prayer, like a catechism, flawed equipment, confirmation bias, isolation-induced delusion, loneliness. Still, On one of the old phone videos, the one I never deleted, the one I've watched 100 times, you can hear my voice reading out a genetic sequence. Underneath, if you turn the volume all the way up and listen very carefully between the words, there they are. Knock, knock, knock. Every time I play it, I tell myself it's just the house, the old cabin shifting in the cold, an artifact of the recording, compression noise, nothing more. But I don't delete it, can't delete it, because part of me is afraid of what forgetting Bigfoot would mean, of losing that connection, and part of me is afraid of what remembering Bigfoot might bring back someday. So that brings me here, to this tape, with the rain on the roof and the refrigerator humming and my hands shaking just enough to make the cassette rattle when I flip it to the other side. I'm not making this for the internet. I'm not trying to go viral with some sensational Bigfoot story that'll get dissected and mocked. I'm an old man trying to put a weight down before I go, before this knowledge dies with me. I had evidence once, real, solid, shocking evidence that would have made headlines around the world, would have rewritten textbooks. 7 years of late nights, coffee gone cold in the cup, insomnia, 3 knocks on the wall keeping me company. I could have put Bigfoot into science, into classrooms, into museums, into every argument about what's out there in the wilderness. I could have proven they exist. I chose not to. And then, when the men on my porch came with their questions and their quiet threats, that choice got locked in permanently. For my safety, they implied. For my family's safety. For whatever passes as a family in those woods. People think if you see Bigfoot, if you prove Bigfoot exists, it'll change everything overnight. Headlines and fame and history books. Truth is, it changes the small things. How you look at the tree line when you're alone. How you feel about the knocks you hear in old houses at night. Whether you trust numbers and data more than the feeling in your chest when something unseen breathes on the other side of a door. I still don't know if I did the right thing. Maybe keeping quiet was cowardice, the easy path. Maybe it was mercy, the kind thing. Maybe I'm just an old fool who misread data and branches and smells and built Bigfoot out of loneliness and isolation and the human need to find meaning in random events. But on nights like this, when the wind comes down off the Cascades the way it used to, and the walls creak just so, I'm back in that basement. I can smell wet fur and pennies and earth. I can see a single eye catching the porch light, watching me with what looked like sadness. I can hear the deliberate, patient knocking. And somewhere under all the hums and hisses of this recording, underneath the rain and the refrigerator and my own breathing, I swear I can still hear it. Knock, knock, knock. That's why I'm telling you. Not to prove anything, not to convince skeptics or win arguments. Just so someone else carries the memory of Bigfoot when I'm gone. So it doesn't die completely. Because whether I was right or wrong, whether it was real or mistaken, the feeling of being watched with something like sorrow, that never left me. And I still hear the 3 knocks, even now, even here. Sometimes I wonder if I always will.